If you want to take your content to the next level, using true visualization is the way to do it, so get a shovel and dig this. There are 6 main steps for taking text-based content and turning it into visuals. First, understand the audience. Then identify the key message or story of your slide. Next, decide what the key objects are in that story and whether there are any secondary objects, before establishing relationships between them and identifying transitions. Then you get into creating some visuals and adding any secondary details before finally designing the finished slides with polish and pizzazz. An important thing to note is that most of the process is done with the information as text, not pictures, because actually determining the right story has a huge role to play in developing the best visuals for the slide. To make your communication truly effective, you need to understand the person on the receiving end of your presentation, and to think about what you're trying to achieve with them. Do you need to inform your audience of something, give them information they don't have and help them understand it? Or are you trying to persuade your audience to do something or change their behaviour? Selling is typically a subset of this. It's worth noting that a lot of the time one impacts the other, so you typically need a blended approach of each to make things work. If you're informing your audience, you should have a clear idea of what it is and note down your objective in a couple of words to make it easy to refer back to throughout the process. If you're persuading your audience to do something, think about how the audience will benefit. What's in it for them? Doing that, you can think of a good high-level punchline to work your story towards. The options are many and various, but something short and punchy helps to make the story worth listening to. Once you've decided what you're trying to achieve, you need to decide what information to present to your audience. You'll also need to assess how well informed the audience already is on the topic, so you don't repeat anything they already know unnecessarily. Typically, anything you visualize has a lot of detailed content with relatively little structure, so it's helpful to focus on the core message, put it into a clear structure to make it easy to understand, and then choose the right detail to bring it all together. We find the easiest approach is to create a cohesive story that flows, and often the framework of problem, solution, impact works well. The problem sets up the context, showing why it's important and helps frame the story. The solution provides the detail of what happens or how something works. The impact is the end result, often the outcome your audience will reach. Let's take a look at an example of this in action, something that everyone can get their head around easily. That's right, molecular blood transfusion research. Okay, here's an extract from an article in The Economist called Blood Transfusion Painted Out. We'll work through the visualization process to create an informative visual that tells the story of what Dr. Tabrizian's process does and what's so effective about it. What do you think? Well, without giving you a reasonable amount of time to read it, first impressions are that, in a presentation, it's pretty difficult to deal with. So let's break it down. Pick out the relevant pieces of information and organize them into a cohesive story using the problem-solution impact framework so that the audience can easily follow along. The problem is that foreign blood cells are attacked by the recipient's immune system. The solution is to cover up the antigenic proteins using 2 layers of material that the immune system doesn't recognize. And the impact is that the transfused blood cells become invisible. So from that, this is what you get. 3 neat, easy statements to help you structure and understand the story. The next job is to identify the objects that are crucial to telling the story. Typically, these are physical things like objects or people. You can easily spot some of these. Any mention of people, job roles or companies could be represented by a photo, silhouette or company logo. Then you might have mentioned things that aren't people but still recognizable entities, like objects or a product or service, which might be a little bit more abstract but still a concept that you can easily put a label on. Pretty straightforward visually, you could use an icon to represent the concept, a photo of the product, or a label or a logo for it. There's also quotes, which can be useful, but if you want to show a direct quote from someone, try to keep it short. It should really speak for itself, which means you're going to have to keep quiet and let the audience read it, so try to edit it if you can to keep it concise. You might have locations, which could be a point on a map, a city, a type of building, or an office floor plan. Or it could be something more abstract, like an objective or a target you're aiming towards. And then you might be able to pick out some data, like any figures, percentages, dates, costs, that sort of thing. Or some kind of measurable quantity, which is similar, but they're more vague. Concepts that you can quantify, but that don't really have any numbers attached to them. Things like the level of risk, confidence, or effort. So there's a starter gallery of different types of key objects. But what these things all have in common is that they're all things that you can represent with some sort of visual device that can easily be recognized, so you don't have to do too much explanation and the audience doesn't spend too long trying to figure out what it is. You might be using pictures, icons, or labels to represent these things, or they might make up some part of diagram, which is what we're going to look at in the next part of the process. So to go back to our blood transfusion story, within the key messages, these are probably the key objects. The foreign blood cells and recipient's immune system represented by antibodies, the antigenic proteins and 2 layers of material, and the transfused blood cells. The complex issue with this story is that we need to identify the antigenic proteins from the solution part of the text and incorporate them into the problem for the problem to really make sense. So with this process, you need to think carefully about what key objects are needed to make all parts of your story work and flow together. Once you know what's involved in the story, you can then look at the relationships between each of the key objects and how they interact, which will give you the layout of the slide. There are plenty of options, but there are a few reliable regulars that you can draw on. First, you've got your different types of graph, which will probably be the first choice if you're showing data. You could make an XY graph, 2 axes, and the data might be bars or lines, or an XY graph that shows a 3-dimensional dataset which might shrink or stretch across the 3 axes. A pie chart to show proportions. This might be useful if you have percentages, as long as they all belong to the same category, or you can have a matrix arrangement showing where elements are placed in different regions. Then you've got a few ways of laying out elements that are distinct from one another. If you've got a sequence of dates in your information, a timeline might be a good choice. Or if you haven't, you could just show a process diagram. You might want to lay out the elements in a 2-dimensional space, or play around with the proportions to make a 3-dimensional scene to add focus on some elements and put others in the background. A hierarchy arrangement can show how elements are ranked in layers, useful for organizational diagrams. Or you could use a mind map style layout to show connections between one big idea and a few other ideas that are linked up to it, or to each other. Then you might want to show just a single image or a single quote that's pretty much self-explanatory on its own. A few other options for showing how things relate to each other might be a cluster or Venn type diagram to show connections or intersections between ideas. A jigsaw if you've got a number of things that fit together to form a larger picture, or just get the idea across that a couple of things are well suited to one another. And if you're talking about a causal relationship where one thing directly affects another, a balanced diagram might work well, or a sequence that shows a push-pull relationship between 2 things. This is a fairly small selection of the types of layouts you could come up with, and a lot of slides might use 2 or more of these at once in order to get a complex idea across. To work out which ones to go for, you'll have to look at your information and think about how you'd explain it, the order you'd point to your key objects, and how those key objects are related to each other. Crucially, you also have to think about the overarching message that the slide is supposed to be getting across, which you established in stages 1 and 2. The key relationships of this story are the antigenic proteins on a red blood cell, the immune system attracted to the antigenic proteins, the layers covering the antigenic protein, and the immune system not being attracted to the antigenic protein. It's also important to check that the story flows between the stages you've built up. Think about the changes in the relationship that you have and check that they support the story. Is something being added or subtracted? Are 2 or more things being combined? In this case, an addition with 2 layers of material added to the red blood cells, and a reversal where the immune system is no longer attracted by foreign blood cells. Now that you have the key objects and the relationships between them, you need to bring everything together into a coherent sequence. And it's typically animations that will help you do this, as you apply them to the different elements on the slide. It's a crucial part of visualization because it helps you to pace the flow of information and keep your audience focused on the right thing at the right time, and basically tell the story. So if you're introducing new ideas, you can add things to the slide. If you're simplifying a diagram or removing things you don't need, you can remove. You can make things grow or shrink to show changing amounts or changing importance. And you can also make things move around to new locations. If you want to combine elements together, you can merge them into one or connect them together. You can highlight something that's especially important for your key message and show something being passed along from one person to another or data being transferred. You can also change something into something else by replacing it. Again, there are countless examples of these, but you'll probably want to use a few of them for each slide. This should give you a few good ideas of ways to move your key objects around, change the relationships, and end up with the right kind of visual punchline. These things can all be done with native PowerPoint animation. And check out our masterclass schedule for a lesson on animation if you're not already a master at it, at BrightCarbon.com. You can now lay out these ideas visually to capture the relationships. The key objects could actually still be text at this point. That will mean, in this case, having the red blood cells, antigens, and antibodies in the problem section. To help clarify the story, you might want to add some supporting details. In particular, it would be useful to show an example of the recipient's own blood cells so that you can show a comparison to emphasize the key differences. And then show the interaction of the antibodies with the foreign antigens connecting to the foreign blood cell, perhaps with a motion path, and of course ignoring the recipient blood cell. Then in the solution section, you can show something to cover up the antigens, perhaps just a simple wrap around them like you've painted the outside, 2 colours for the 2 different layers. And finally, show the antibodies not interacting with the foreign blood cells and just moving past. What do you think? Does this help you to understand the fairly complex process? I suspect so. And if it helps you, imagine the impact it can have when your entire audience follows along in the same way. Finally, you can take those layouts and turn them into properly designed content by incorporating real images, pictures, and icons, perhaps with a decent background for better context. It's nice to zoom into the slide and focus on what's important by blurring out anything that's not needed in the background. Then you can add in text labels for individual parts of the diagram if you think it's appropriate, and it isn't always needed at all. Then use animation as required to sequence the flow of information. So in this case, bringing in the antibodies and showing them engaging with the foreign antigens on the transfused blood cells, which then leads to an immune response that causes problems. However, with the new technique, by coating the foreign blood cells with 2 layers of material, the antibodies don't come into contact with the foreign antigens, and so move along merrily on their way to seek out other troublesome invaders and protect the body. So go to it, make things beautiful, make things dynamic, and most of all, make them visual and useful to your audience.